This week on Africa Weekly, we focus on northeast Nigeria, where people fleeing Boko Haram attacks are starving and desperate for help. We visit a new museum charting the history of slavery in Guinea-Bissau, and we take you to a school in a Parisian suburb that's helping to integrate 15 migrant children from Africa into formal education. But first, a summary of the stories that made the headlines this week. At least 100 people were killed after a boat crowded with migrants capsized off the Egyptian coast on Wednesday. Survivors have said that up to 450 migrants were on board the fishing vessel that was heading to Italy from Egypt when it keeled over off the port of Rosetta. The military said it had rescued over 160 survivors, mainly Egyptians, Sudanese and Eritreans. Authorities have arrested 4 suspected people traffickers over the tragedy, the latest in what the UN Refugee Agency expects to be the deadliest year on record for the Mediterranean. Opposition headquarters were torched in renewed violence between police and opponents of President Joseph Kabila, rallying in Kinshasa earlier this week to demand that the long-serving president steps down this year. Police claimed that 32 people were killed during the clashes, while the opposition reported more than 100 dead, some of them burned alive. The UN has warned of a large-scale crisis if calm is not restored and accused the state of using excessive force against protesters. Kabila has ruled the DRC since 2001 and is barred from running for another term under the constitution, but no date has been set for new elections that should follow the end of his term in December. Locals have been withdrawing cash and stockpiling food, worried that any fresh unrest could see the streets blocked with checkpoints as Gabon's constitutional court prepared to announce the final ruling on last month's presidential election results. Lawyers of both incumbent President Ali Bongo and opposition leader Jean Ping have agreed to a poll recount, although they disagreed over its scope. Gabonese ministers have threatened to arrest Ping if there is an upsurge in violence, which Ping has predicted will happen if the court rules to uphold Bongo's wafer-thin victory. Protests broke out on several university campuses across South Africa after higher education institutions were given the green light on Monday to raise fees by up to 8% for the 2017 academic year. Last year, students secured a 0% fee increase after weeks of demonstrations rocked the government and had demanded a freeze on all fees until a commission into university funding was complete. Despite Nigeria's battle against Boko Haram militants, the conflict is claiming its victims. According to the United Nations, 4.5 million people need food aid in northern Nigeria, of whom 65,000 are facing famine.
On the brink of death, 2-year-old Abdullahi is dying from hunger. His mother can barely watch as a team of doctors work to save her son. This intensive care unit is in Maiduguri, in northeast Nigeria, where many victims of Boko Haram have fled, seeking refuge. Here, the Doctors Without Borders team treat the most serious cases of malnutrition every day. They're seeing an increasing number of children starving and desperate.
Several of them, they have a very serious condition. They are critical patients. And mainly the disease that we see all the day in the ICU are related to sepsis, pneumonia, malaria, diarrhea.
For 7 years, the Islamist militant group Boko Haram has waged its bloody insurgency across the north of Nigeria and into the border region of Lake Chad. An estimated 20,000 people have died. More than 2.6 million have had to flee their homes. Now the United Nations estimate that some 65,000 people are living in famine. Even emergency medical teams are shocked at what they're seeing.
The last time we had such serious cases was like when we had the Nigerian Civil War, when people behind the front lines, and immediately the crisis was resolved, that were able to come out, and we saw very, very bad cases.
The UN says it now needs $714 million to fund its programmes. But with Nigeria now in recession, it's only received 21% of the $484 million it needs. And the situation may be worse than feared, with some rural areas cut off by fighting and insecurity.
Right now, more than half of the region is still inaccessible. So there are still a lot of people out there who need a lot of help.
With land destroyed or mined, farmers unable to grow crops and water sources contaminated, hunger has now become the collateral damage of the insurgency.
The horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Branded, whipped and bound, hundreds of thousands of Africans were shipped from the town of Cachayú in Guinea-Bissau to the Americas between the 15th and 18th century. And even the building housing this new memorial museum played its part.
This was a trading house for local and other products. And how was this done? It was actually through direct exchanges of local commodities for men and European commodities for men. There are items that bear witness to that.
Groups of slaves were fed from communal pots.
Despite its size, it wasn't enough to feed everyone. The portions were quite small and the dishes were quite basic. It was all cooked quickly so they could get back to work.
Other slaving sites like Senegal's Gorée Island are firmly on the tourist map, visited by heads of state including US President Barack Obama. Now Guinea-Bissau, one of the poorest countries in the world, wants its own share of tourists. The idea for the museum was born in 2010 when a group of slave descendants, identified by their DNA, visited Cachayú from Brazil and the Antilles.
When they came, they started to tell their stories. Lots of people cried that day, and others were saying, maybe that one is my relative. We organized a dance, and even I danced that day. We hugged and shook each other's hands.
In Guinea-Bissau, the history of the slave coast still isn't taught in local schools. But the hope is that here, where slaves left the continent, new tourists will arrive, and the museum will keep memories of the traumatic colonial past alive.
Bonjour, monsieur. It's the first day at a new school for 12-year-old Deborah. She recently moved to Paris from her home in the Central African Republic, joining her father who settled here 17 years ago. Deborah is enrolled in a special class, which prepares migrant pupils for studying in France. All 15 pupils have migrated to France from countries in Africa or Asia. Some have only ever been taught in traditional Islamic schools, but they are keen to get to grips with the French system.
I've only been here for one day. I want to become someone so I can help my parents.
With 12 hours of French lessons a week plus 6 hours of other subjects, most pupils are able to join the school's regular classes with French students after 1 to 3 years. It's a challenging educational journey, especially for pupils for whom even getting to school is tough.
It can be astonishing to see sometimes small children who only speak a little French, taking the subway and 2 buses just to get here, and that's after moving homes, moving schools, reintegrating.
Last year, more than 52,000 non-French speaking students enrolled in French schools. While classes like these help them to integrate and learn, schools often welcome the cultural diversity they bring. In this class alone, 20 different languages and dialects are spoken from around the world.
Ivorian Yaya Toure, 4-time African Footballer of the Year, has announced his retirement from international football, calling it an incredibly difficult decision. The 33-year-old Manchester City midfielder, capped 113 times, including appearances at 3 World Cup finals, made his Ivory Coast debut in 2004. Next week, we take you to Kenya to meet the Maasai warriors who have swapped hunting for protecting lions instead. That's all from us at Africa Weekly. Until next week.